Hey, amazing viewers, I love connecting with you all around the world. Stay with me until the end, because what I'm about to share will leave you inspired and ready to take control of your own life. In today's story, you'll hear about an incredible twist that no one saw coming. Also, if this is your first time here, press the subscribe button and join our incredible journey. The door of the luxury car dealership swung open, and a man dressed in a simple polo shirt and worn jeans walked in. At first glance, he looked just like any other customer, a regular guy in the market for a new car. He strolled into the showroom, his presence almost unnoticed amidst the hustle and bustle of shiny sports cars and polished luxury vehicles. But what no one knew was that he wasn't just another customer. Jonathan Reyes, the owner of the very dealership he now walked into, was about to see just how far his staff's prejudice would go. Jonathan had learned long ago that appearances could deceive, but people's treatment of others often revealed much more. Growing up in a modest neighborhood in Cincinnati, he had seen firsthand how the world judged people before they ever had a chance to speak. He had worked tirelessly to break free from that bias, building an empire in the auto industry, but he had never forgotten the sting of being judged by the way he looked. So today, dressed casually as a test, he had decided to put his own business to the test. He stood quietly, near a sleek silver coupe, watching as the sales staff swooned over an impeccably dressed businessman who had just walked in. The difference in treatment was clear. The employees greeted the well-dressed man with eagerness, offering him drinks and leading him to VIP showrooms with promises of a test drive. Meanwhile, Jonathan, in his modest attire, stood there, invisible. The clock ticked on. 30 minutes passed, and still, no one had acknowledged him. Not a greeting, not even a glance. It wasn't just indifference, it was dismissiveness. It was as if his presence didn't matter. He wasn't important enough to be given the same courtesy, the same respect. And yet, right in front of him, the VIP treatment was being lavished on someone else. The stark contrast was impossible to ignore. Jonathan's frustration was growing. But it wasn't the lack of service that irritated him the most. It was the fact that people had already decided who mattered and who didn't, based purely on appearances. He had seen it before. It wasn't the first time he had experienced this kind of bias, and it wouldn't be the last. But this time, it would be different. He would show them exactly what it meant to misjudge a person. He leaned casually against the car, watching the chaos unfold as a young salesman in a navy suit walked past him, paying him no mind. Jonathan didn't flinch. He had faced much worse in his life. But today, his anger wasn't just about his own experience. It was about everyone who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or ignored simply because they didn't fit the expected mold. Finally, he made his move. Slowly, he walked toward the reception desk, offering a friendly smile, hoping for the bare minimum of acknowledgement. Instead, the receptionist barely glanced at him before speaking in a tone that could have been more dismissive. "Sales reps are busy," she said flatly, tapping at her keyboard. "You can wait outside if you're just looking." Jonathan's smile faded, but he remained calm. He hadn't planned on this being easy. In fact, this was exactly the reaction he had expected. But it was only the beginning. The staff had no idea who he really was. The man they had just dismissed was the very person who had built this business from the ground up. And soon, they would all learn exactly what it meant to treat people with disrespect. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number, his calm demeanor masking the storm that was brewing. When the call connected, he spoke two words that would change everything. "I need you here." The showroom buzzed with the quiet hum of conversation and the occasional clink of a glass. Jonathan watched as the employees fawned over a well-dressed man in a tailored suit who had just entered. He stood confidently near the sports cars, chatting animatedly with the sales staff, while Jonathan, standing just a few feet away, was treated like an invisible ghost. The contrast between the two couldn't have been clearer, and it wasn't lost on Jonathan. What disturbed him more wasn't the lack of service. It was the certainty in the eyes of the employees. They had already decided who was worth their time and who wasn't. To them, a man in a polo and jeans couldn't possibly be a serious buyer. They didn't know his name, his wealth, or his status, yet they had made up their minds in seconds. The truth was, Jonathan wasn't a stranger to this kind of treatment. It was something he had dealt with his entire life, being judged by how he looked rather than who he was. But today, he wasn't just going to let it slide. Today, he was going to expose the ugly side of discrimination in the place he had worked so hard to build. He didn't respond immediately, but rather, he watched in silence as the sales staff continued to offer impeccable service to the suited man. Champagne was poured. Seats were offered. It was as if they were vying for his attention, hoping he would be the one to make the purchase. Jonathan let out a quiet, controlled breath, his eyes narrowing just slightly. He wasn't angry yet, but he was definitely disappointed. These were his employees. These were the people representing his brand, his vision. And yet, they had failed miserably at the most basic principle: respect for all customers, no matter who they were or how they looked. He shifted his weight and took a step closer to the reception desk. A young receptionist, no older than 25, barely looked up from her keyboard when he approached. "Excuse me," Jonathan said, his voice polite but firm. "I was hoping to speak to someone about a purchase." She didn't even meet his gaze as she coolly waved a hand in his direction. "Sales reps are busy," she muttered, tapping away at her keyboard. "You can wait outside if you're just looking." The sting of dismissal hit harder than expected, but Jonathan kept his composure. "Outside," he repeated, his voice calm. "I thought this was a place for customers to shop." The receptionist didn't seem to care. She simply nodded and went back to her work. Jonathan didn't let his frustration show. He knew exactly what he needed to do. He pulled his phone from his pocket, scrolled through his contacts, and tapped the name he needed. A couple of rings later, a deep voice answered. "I need you here now," Jonathan said, ending the call quickly. The employees still had no clue who they were dealing with. They had no idea that the man they had so carelessly dismissed was the very person who had built this empire from the ground up. They had no idea that the car dealership they worked in, the luxury cars they showed off so confidently, all belonged to Jonathan Race, the man they had sent outside without a second thought. But they were about to find out. Jonathan's expression remained unchanged as he glanced toward the man in the suit, now sipping champagne, being doted on by the sales team. He could feel the sting of the treatment, but it wasn't just about him anymore. He wondered how many other people had been treated the same way. How many potential customers had walked out of this dealership, discouraged, disappointed, or angry, simply because they didn't look the part. As he stood there, waiting for the moment to arrive, Jonathan thought about how this dealership was supposed to reflect his values: hard work, equality, respect for everyone, no matter where they came from or how they were dressed. But today, the truth was clearer than ever. His employees had lost sight of those values. They had forgotten the most important lesson of all: how you treat others defines who you truly are. The sleek black Rolls-Royce Phantom pulled up outside, the sound of its engine a low purr that reverberated through the showroom. Jonathan turned toward the door. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The employees had no idea what was coming, but soon they would learn a lesson they would never forget. The door to the showroom swung open once more, and in walked a tall man in a charcoal suit, adjusting his cufflinks as he stepped into the dealership. His presence was commanding, a sharp contrast to the hustle and bustle of the employees who had been so focused on the man in the tailored suit earlier. But this wasn't just any customer. This was the moment Jonathan had been waiting for. As soon as the man entered, the energy in the showroom shifted. The salespeople, who had been lounging around, ignoring Jonathan just moments before, suddenly sprang to life. "Good afternoon, sir," one of them said, a little too eagerly. "What brings you in today? We just got in a new shipment of imports. We might have exactly what you're looking for." The others quickly followed, offering a glass of champagne, pulling out chairs, and acting as if they had been waiting for him all along. But Jonathan wasn't impressed. He stood quietly, watching the scene unfold in front of him. The employees' actions were almost choreographed, their behavior a stark reminder of the bias that had been on full display for the last hour. These people had treated him like an outsider, like he didn't belong here. But now that the man in the suit had arrived, they were all over him, desperate to please, eager to sell. It wasn't the first time Jonathan had seen this kind of treatment in the world of luxury retail, but it was the first time he had ever been on the receiving end. He stood there, calm and composed, but inside, he was seething. He had worked his entire life to build this business, this empire, and he was not about to let it be tarnished by the lack of respect from his own employees. Jonathan's thoughts were interrupted by a voice from behind. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you not to touch that." It was Ron, the older salesman who had so dismissively sent him to the pre-owned lot earlier. He stood with a stiff expression, arms crossed, as if he had the authority to dictate what Jonathan could and couldn't do in his own dealership. "Accessible," Jonathan repeated calmly, glancing toward the man who was now getting treated like royalty. "Tell me, Ron, how is this man being treated differently from me?" His voice remained level, but the weight of the question hung in the air. Ron blinked, clearly taken aback by Jonathan's directness. "Sir, we cater to a very specific clientele," he said, attempting to brush off the awkwardness of the situation. But Jonathan wasn't letting him off the hook that easily. "I see," Jonathan said with a slight smile. He reached into his pocket and dialed a number. The phone rang twice before a deep, calm voice answered. "I need you here," Jonathan said simply, and hung up the phone without another word. The showroom remained oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. The employees were too busy with the man in the suit, too wrapped up in their assumptions about who mattered and who didn't. They didn't realize who they were dealing with. They didn't know that the man they had treated so poorly was the very one who owned the business, the one who had worked tirelessly to make it what it was today. They had no idea that their actions were about to cost them everything. Moments later, the sound of a sleek black Rolls-Royce Phantom pulling up outside echoed through the showroom. The valet hurried to open the door, and a tall figure stepped out. As the man in the charcoal suit entered the dealership, the room fell silent. Employees straightened up, suddenly aware of the shift in energy. They were no longer focused on the well-dressed man. They were focused on the man who had just walked in. But it wasn't the well-dressed customer they had been doting on. It was Jonathan Riss, the owner of the dealership, and he was standing there, watching them. The showroom was now frozen. The employees who had ignored Jonathan, who had treated him with such disdain, were now trembling in fear. Ron, the salesman who had sent Jonathan to the pre-owned lot, was visibly pale as he realized his mistake. Jonathan stood there, his expression calm but unwavering, the weight of his presence unmistakable. And then, with a cold and deliberate tone, Jonathan spoke. "So tell me, is this how we treat people here?" The room remained silent. The employees had no words to offer. The truth had come crashing down on them with the force of a sledgehammer. They had been so quick to judge, so quick to assume that someone didn't belong. And now, they were being held accountable for their actions. The lesson was clear. Respect is not something you earn based on appearances, wealth, or status. It is something you give freely, to everyone, no matter who they are or how they look. Jonathan Riss had built his empire on the foundation of respect, integrity, and fairness. And today, he had just reminded his employees of the most important lesson of all. How you treat others defines who you truly are. With a steady breath, Jonathan turned and walked out of the showroom, leaving the employees to reflect on their actions. The consequences of their behavior were already set in motion, and they knew there was no turning back. In that moment, they had learned the true meaning of respect. And for Jonathan, this was just another reminder that in business, as in life, integrity and character will always shine through. No matter how you're dressed, no matter what you own, you must always remember to treat others the way you wish to be treated. Because in the end, it's not about the money or the cars. It's about the respect you give to every person who walks through your doors.